Hare Om Namaha. When you take to genuine spiritual life, there is an initial stage, which is inspiring and enlivening. A beautiful mystery of human opportunity is revealed to you during this stage. Although for most Westerners, it generally consists of impersonal realizations. Becoming a transcendentalist has its rewards. That stage is nice, obviously, but it is also sentimental, at least in most cases. As sincerity and seriousness increases in spiritual life, if it does increase beyond those initial sentiments, the aspiring transcendentalist will eventually come into contact with Krishna consciousness. It is unavoidable because exploring the mystery of human existence, both within and without, is not just an occult endeavor, but it also entails searching out the absolute truth, and that absolute truth is Vaishnavism, and it consists of perfect philosophy. In the Sampradaya, and Sampradaya is also known as a disciplic succession, in the Sampradaya which Srila Prabhupada represented, that flawless philosophy is known as the Chintya Vedha Veda Tattva, the best of such explanations. Every disciplic succession is also known as a Guru Parampara, and Prabhupada is the most recent God-realized, empowered founder Acharya in our line, which can be traced back to Madhvacharya on the human plane. It is the duty of any serious and serious disciple, any sincere and serious disciple of Prabhupada, to accurately represent the perfect philosophy which he gave us, including both the Tattva and Siddhanta which he expounded. In order to understand what has happened to the Krishna consciousness movement, you must understand its history over the last 40 plus years. Along with this, you must know the flawed paradigms being pushed by other initiatives that claim to be the Hare Krishna movement. You must become aware as to whether or not any of those, such as the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation, Neomat, and Ritvik, represent authorization from the founder Acharya, or whether, on the other hand, they are deviations. In this search, there will be unpleasant realizations. The stage of economy will soon come to an end. You will be forced to expect the unexpected. You will be impelled by the force of your sincerity to confront the disappointments that are the result of many deviations that have emerged from the ocean of nescience after the disappearance of His Divine Grace Prabhupada in 1977. Was any of it predestined? If so, how does that fit into your personal destiny? Is free will involved in any of this? We shall touch upon these important questions in this month's presentation. On the subject of destiny, we find the following excerpt from a letter to one of Prabhupada's leading secretaries dated October 21st, 1975. Quote, Anyone who surrenders to Krishna, his destiny is changed by the omnipotency of God. God will save you from the destiny that you have created by misuse of your independence. He knows, but still he is so kind. Surrender has nothing to do with your destiny. That will depend upon you because you have a little independence. Predestiny is there, but it is canceled if you surrender to him. Otherwise, God would not be the controller. If you surrender to Krishna, there is no predestiny. So why do you suffer? You take his advice. Even if someone says predestined, so why don't you surrender to Krishna now and get out of this material condition? Unquote. We shall use the noun predestination instead of predestiny in discussing the ramifications of this important excerpt. Notice, free will is included in it, expressed as, quote unquote, a little independence. In order to understand the Hare Krishna movement of Krishna consciousness in contemporary Western culture, destiny and free will are integral to that realization. And the discussion of chaos is also an unavoidable part of the mix. The strong current of a late 70s deviation still runs through what so-called ISKCON is today. It has devastated the central nervous system of the cult since the spring of 1978. Its initiating gurus are all agents of chaos. Despite the 11 great pretenders being exposed by the mid-80s, almost all of them were allowed to remain institutional gurus as so-called madhyams and keep their cheap disciples. This corruption was never uprooted in so-called ISKCON, and most unfortunately, it probably never will be. As you all know, those of you who regularly watch my video presentations, I generally refer to the organization as so-called ISKCON or ISKCON with quotation marks on each side of the acronym. That will be the case today also. I'm not going to be referring to the real ISKCON movement because it was murdered in the late 70s. So whether I say so-called ISKCON or I go like this when I say ISKCON, I'm referring to the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation. And there is no effective reform to be had there. All of their bluffing and cheating was never confronted at its roots. And it has certainly not been eradicated since the late 70s. All of today's ISKCON gurus are 100% still connected to that original current of deviation. But neither they nor their disciples want to be reminded of it. But I shall continue to remind them of it. Now, cancel culture operates in any bhakti cult that has deviated from the parampara. In the late 70s, as major problems in their movement began to surface, the vitiated governing body decided to employ vilification and ostracism. This was meant to deflect from the actual problem. In neglecting the possibility of any objective analysis of the situation, because that analysis was only being propagated by dissidents, the rank and file was beginning to see that the ISKCON scheme was deeply flawed. So let us return to a discussion about destiny. The first transformation of 1978 in so-called ISKCON was cent% under the control of fate. We want authority, as a West Coast zonal would put it. Each ISKCON guru was to be the final authority in his zone. In the banquet hall of one major European temple, the zonal acharya, soon after he returned from his 1978 guru appointment in India, drew a line on the floor. He ordered the inmates who accepted him as Mahabhagavat to go to one side of it, and all the others to move to the other side. Those who went to that other side were asked to leave. This is an example of how the ISKCON cancel culture worked. The new guru dispensation of the zonal acharya concoction was not meant for being explained. Instead, devotees were told that this is the way it is. And that's how it went down in the late 70s. Accept or leave. In effect, most of Prabhupada's disciples had their spiritual progress and devotional life impeded by that cataclysm. Their only choice was which way they wanted to experience destiny's fateful degradation. Some capitulated. Another way of saying the same thing is that they stayed in the temple and worshiped men who did not at all deserve to be honored whatsoever. By that choice, their path to enlightenment was completely bollocksed up. On the other side of the coin, there were those who were directly or indirectly forced to leave because they did not believe in, or in some cases could not stomach, the new dispensation. Those who spoke out against it, there weren't many of them, they were condemned within the cult and certainly ostracized. When tossed back into the material world, it was a spiritual death sentence. In effect, most of them were hung on the rope of their latent material desires, which would otherwise have been controlled in a bona fide ashram. This was one of the primary reasons why Srila Prabhupada created the organizational structure that he did. The party men at the turn of the century were essentially not much different from their earlier version 2 decades previously. By Y2K, however, the situation itself had changed to a considerable degree. Nevertheless, their basic attitude had not. They still didn't really want to take a close look at what they had done to the movement, which means they were unwilling to walk back the cat. But we walk it back. Regarding the devotees that had been directly or indirectly expelled in the beginning years, the ones who had turned out were pretty much right in their initial criticisms of the governing body, especially when information that was hidden came their way. Those cold cases and files were considered arcane by the turn of the century. As long as the party men still controlled the temples, and as long as they all gave continuous lip service to the ultimate managing authority of the vitiated GBC, everything else could be ignored, like covered tracks at the beginning of winter, later in the winter. As long as they had an organized religion wherein there was still enough revenue to keep them from having to work in the mundane world, as long as they could show bottle well-dressed and nicely decorated deities, they remained complacent. As long as they could host colorful initiation ceremonies, as long as they had a publication house, as long as they could advertise a hierarchical structure parroting their brand of institutional dogma, they were satisfied. They knew that they could survive the influence of the malcontents. After all, history is written by the winners, and that's who they appeared to be. As far as righting all of those wrongs they had perpetrated, that was never allowed to even cross their minds. Material destiny is always like that. In order to right those wrongs, it would have had to have been done at the radical level, and that was out of the question. As far as the devotees they had branded as deviants, well, those fellows must have gotten what they deserved, because not a blade of grass moves without the will of the Supreme. This was their attitude. And that attitude remained unchanged from the time the 11 great pretenders hijacked the movement. Realize that you can only transcend the ISKCON anomaly when you understand it. This understanding is what you are now receiving. Let us consider the following 3 quotes from His Divine Grace. The first one, from Chaitanya Charitamrita Adi Leela, Chapter 1, Text 35, Purport. Quote, "One should always remember that a person who is reluctant to accept a spiritual master and be initiated is sure to be baffled in his endeavor to go back to Godhead. One who is not properly initiated may present himself as a great devotee, but in fact, he is sure to encounter many stumbling blocks on his path of progress towards spiritual realization, with the result that he must continue his term of material existence without relief. Such a helpless person is compared to a ship without a rudder, for such a ship can never reach its destination." Unquote. And now this excerpt from a platform lecture given by Prabhupada on March 2nd, 1966 in New York. Quote, "The spiritual master guides him. He also makes question to the spiritual master, and he guides him so that his life, his progress of life, may be systematic. Now, to take such guidance means the spiritual master should be a very perfect man, otherwise how can he guide?" Unquote. Then this excerpt from a letter to Achyutananda dated August 21st, 1968. Quote, "Don't be allured by cheap disciples. If you immediately become guru, then the service attitude and activities will be stopped, as there are many cheap gurus and cheap disciples without any substantial knowledge and manufacturing new sampradayas, and with service activities stopped and all spiritual progress choked up. You have already mentioned one such non-bona fide sampradaya, the Jaya Krishna sampradaya." Unquote. Let's consider these 3 excerpts in context, and after due consideration, let us tie them together into the obvious purport of those conclusions, especially with that quote on material and spiritual destiny, which means on faith and providence. Where does so-called ISKCON actually stand in that overall context? However, first, we must consider relevancy. Consider this from Prabhupada's translation of Canto 6, Chapter 8, verse 31. Quote, "Cause and effect are factually one because the cause is present in the effect." Unquote. Allow me to repeat it, please. Cause and effect are factually one because the cause is present in the effect. You are a fool if you do not recognize and acknowledge the root issues that have produced what superficially appears to be the Krishna consciousness movement of today, cracked into many different groups. Genuine Krishna consciousness is centripetal. So-called Krishna consciousness scatters and is centrifugal. Which is it today? That is a rhetorical question, of course. And what are those root issues that have led us to this current manifestation of centrifugal corruption? They all were from the late 70s. For starters, one cause, the unauthorized creation of an untouchable Acharya board within the governing body. Second cause, the lapping up of bad advice from the Navadvip Mahant. Third cause, the false claim that a Ritvik Acharya automatically becomes a bona fide initiating spiritual master upon the disappearance of the founder Acharya. Fourth cause, the appointment that never was of 11 pretender Mahabhagavats. And fifth cause, the division of the world into 11 exclusive territories run by powerful princes, all of whom came to be known as Acharyas of the zone. When you take to genuine spiritual life, there is an initial stage which is both inspiring and enlivening. By 1978, that initial stage had passed. But it was nevertheless, 1978, a threshold year for the Krishna consciousness movement. Why? Because it marked the emergence of the anomaly, the first anomaly, the emergence of the stranger, the unknown unknown. It was the year of Gaudiya Mat again entering Prabhupada's movement, but that time, that second time, triumphantly. As some of you know, but most of you probably do not, Gaudiya Mat made an unsuccessful attempt before, just at the beginning of the 70s. That attempt was crushed after the aborted coup by the 4 wildcard sannyasis. Hardly anyone in the movement either knew of or remembered that incident in 1978. But it was referred to as follows in a letter to Hangsaduta dated September 2nd, 1970. Quote, "You are also one of the members of the GBC, so you can think over very deeply how to save the situation. It is a fact, however, that the great sinister movement is within our society," unquote. That great sinister movement was and is Gaudiya Mat. In 1978, it was once again relegated to an unknown unknown because due to lack of historical memory. In 1978, Prabhupada was no longer present, physically present, manifest, to crush it. His untimely disappearance was a kind of shock. But that was a known, although most did not think it was going to go down as soon as 1977. It threw most of his devotees into a kind of depression, which is, of course, completely understandable. That depression set them up for the emergence of the stranger. Soon thereafter followed by 11 Ritviks suddenly being worshipped as Mahabhagavats. That was a secondary anomaly. Secondary. That secondary anomaly was, in no small part, the result of the previous emergence of the stranger, Gaudiya Mat. the first anomaly. Its influence was surreptitious and pernicious, and its influence as the primary cause is still felt to this day. The argument that anomalies have an opportunistic element to them, that they are not merely dangerous, that argument is only valid in material culture, and it's not always valid there either. It has no validity in the Krishna consciousness movement. Any and all anomalies that enter spiritual life are dangerous only, especially if they are able to take root. Gaudiya Math influence in the late 70s did take root in a very big way, and very soon after, Prabhupada left the scene. When the massive deviation of the 11 great pretenders gained much more than a foothold, Prabhupada's movement was instantly converted into an anachronism known as an Upasampradaya. We have discussed threadbare the specifics of this both in our articles and our videos. You are free to consult them to advantage. Yet, the Western world at large, particularly the United States, received material benediction in the form of tremendous enjoyment in 1978. It was the era of disco. The hippie movement was fading, but not their music. One of the best rock message groups, the Bee Gees, made a stunning reemergence, and there was the Rocky Mountain High. Enjoyment took a major leap in 1978. That material enjoyment was on the outer plane of the exoteric and in the exoteric itself, and it was tangibly felt. The reason for its emergence came from the esoteric. It was a reward to the United States and to a lesser extent to the rest of the Western world for having allowed Prabhupada to preach in their countries. The 11 great pretenders, all unwitting dupes of Gaudiya Math bad advice, were also enjoying, big time. They were enjoying more than anyone in the history of Kali Yuga. They were the Bannermen of the ISKCON anomaly, though not the initial anomaly. The initial anomaly which entered Prabhupada's society was the Great Sinister Movement, directly called by him that in September of 1970. That excerpt has just been cited previously. The initial anomaly was the stranger, Gaudiya Math, who are what determines Parameshwar's will, who are what determines providence. It is the founder Acharya of the society. When Prabhupada departed, it was up to his leading men, particularly those on the governing body, to cent per cent represent his will to his complete satisfaction. That entailed cent per cent following all of his orders, especially his most important and essential ones. However, just a handful of months after he departed physical manifestation, there was emergence of anomaly. It brought chaos into the society, but not right away. It was a threat to the society's tradition, to its behavior, and to evaluation of its own potential after Prabhupada's disappearance. That anomaly worked to undermine the stability of all of it. The anomaly had deep historical roots in what superficially appeared to be related to Prabhupada's background in India. Tattvamasi. It was a profound anomaly. It was very dangerous. loaded with negative emotion disguised as just the opposite, along with a twisted connotation. It appeared at first only to strengthen the group identity of the society by creating, from within, although it was actually outside, a kind of illusory fear of any conceptions contrary to what it had just injected, which it injected quite successfully via the leading secretaries of so-called ISKCON. That first anomaly represented a revision of the actual history of our movement. That initial anomaly was a product of Gaudiamat. It was an unknown unknown. It was the stranger, and it was completely unexpected. It immediately created a new set of opposing viewpoints in Prabhupada's society, what remained of it. One of the 11 Ritviks spoke out against it at that fateful GVC meeting of 1978 in Mayapur. His minority report was rejected. Gaudiamat influence directly threatened the level of order that Prabhupada had established in his paradigm, an order that was mostly invisible to the rank and file who were not astute in understanding that order's importance. That higher order was breached in many ways after Prabhupada left, and the spiritual and devotional preconceptions which were intrinsically a part of that order were damaged, and soon thereafter completely destroyed. It was a tremendous upheaval in every sense of the term, yet it was subtle. It created a subtle new order that was completely unauthorized in terms of the founder Acharya's wishes and his intent. The chaos it injected hid behind various guises and rationalizations and misrepresentations. The chaos came in the form of apparent unity and diversity, and it changed the motivations of all the devotees who bought into it. There was a counterproductive adaptation in the form of how the 11 pretender Mahabhagavats exploited the new message, the new mood, and the new paradigm introduced by the stranger. What should have been the actual response to the stranger? The response should have been no compromise, complete rejection of that foreign paradigm. Instead, the 11 great pretenders allowed all kinds of mistaken knowledge, warped shibboleths, and a hackneyed Bengali slogan to facilitate the society in abandoning individual needs of the rank and file at every level below their top echelon. It also allowed expanded material enjoyment for them, which matched the mood of the exoteric and ascendancy at that time, as we previously mentioned. Individual self-development was now to be eschewed for the greater good. Individual self-development, which Bhakti Yoga is all about, was to be replaced by group identification, led by the new 11 heartbeats, the new, quote-unquote, acharyas of the zone. All the real workers who remained in the society were restricted by this new dispensation and its mood, its new mood, its oppression, and the first transformation of Prabhupada's Hare Krishna movement of Krishna consciousness, a major transformation. The group's social potential was also bollocksed up. In other words, it doomed the society, effectively murdering it. The devotees were left wide open. with no ability to function within the former means of production. This was because none of them could transcend the insistence by the zonals that everyone adopt a foreign and pathological group identification. The initial anomaly then transmuted into the next stage, the second anomaly, the anomaly directly imposed by the 11 great pretenders, which did have some differences from the first anomaly. Not that many, but some. It was rubber stamped by the vitiated GBC, and all 11 of those men received institutional imprimatur in the process. Now, chaos was delayed for a short time, but it was a known unknown. It should have been foreseen. Everyone but the most blind sees it now. Fyodor Dostoevsky was sent to the Siberian Gulag for writing and speaking against the communist imposition in Russia. He became a great writer in the process, his powerful pen having been forged through egregious injustice. Perhaps one or two of Prabhupada's disciples went through a kind of similar process. Dostoevsky is most famous, of course, for his great novel, The Brothers Karamazov. One chapter in it stands out, The Grand Inquisitor. Let us revisit a bit of that chapter here. The Grand Inquisitor says to his captive, who he considers to be a reincarnation of Jesus Christos, quote, "You came only for the chosen few. If that is so, it is a mystery that we cannot understand. If it is a mystery, we have the right to preach to man that what matters is not freedom of choice or even love. What matters is but a mystery that man must worship blindly, even at the expense of his conscience." And that is exactly what we have done. We have corrected your work, having now founded it upon miracle, mystery, and authority. We lovingly try to lighten the burden of their responsibility, even allowing their weak nature to sin, but with our permission. Why have you come to interfere with our work? I was prepared to take my place among the strong chosen ones, aspiring to be counted among them, but I came to my senses. I refused to serve a mad cause. I turned away and joined those who were endeavoring to correct your work, unquote. Miracle, mystery, and authority. Let us also add secrecy. These are the ways and means of institutional religion. These four pillars were and are often used in so-called ISKCON after Prabhupada's departure. It was considered a miracle that Prabhupada had created, had empowered 11 heartbeats of pure devotion in such a short space of time. It was only one heartbeat for so long. But then, suddenly, it became 11. Miraculous. Except that it wasn't. He had empowered no one to be his successor. He said, regular guru, that's all. A guru under regulation is not a successor. A guru under regulation is a madhyam. He will not be listed in the parampara, like we see at the end of the introduction of Bhagavad Gita. At best, he is a bridge between manifestations of actual Uttama Adhikaris, and they will be listed in the Guru Parampara. The Uttama is the real successor. He is the miracle. The emergence of 11 great pretenders was the emergence of Prakrita Sahajas. And there's no miracle integral to that. In India, it's very common, and unfortunately, it's quite common here now, too. Let us segue to mystery. This mystery is primarily pushed in the form of the GBC mystique. It is not pushed, however, via word of mouth or the written word. Instead, it is pushed by vibe. The world is infused with mystery, and the idea that ISKCON, triumphalism, is unstoppable via its governing body can only dovetail with the GBC mystique. Now, you should understand that reason is the way of the demigods, because heaven is attained by action in the mode of goodness, to which reason is integral. Yet it can be argued that the spiritual world is not a realm wherein reason has any importance or play whatsoever. Granting that point, we must also understand the difference between the irrational and the supra-rational. So-called ISKCON is heavily plugged into the irrational and the absurd. This can be passed off to the unintelligent and to the no-think chelas as supra-rational, when it is anything but. The irrational is in the mode of ignorance. However, when it is successfully passed off as a kind of magical mystery tour, the diabolical gains a foothold, because neither reason nor ethics is able to overcome it within a paradigm of fascination. The uncanny attraction sets in. The mystique becomes bolstered, and hardly anyone is able to see that the Peter principle being more incompetence the further up you climb the lattice work of the bureaucracy, the Peter principle is what is actually going down. The unexpected takes hold, as irrational actions have consequences, and the novelty of the GBC mystique ascends. The GBC becomes the so-called successor. This was even posted by so-called ISKCON for some time on the internet before an internal review removed it from continuous online influence. Reject the mystery of the GBC mystique, because it is nothing more than a sorcerer behind another curtain blowing horns, bells, and whistles without any real substance. So now let us next segue to the pretense of authority, institutional authority. The ultimate managing authority of the GBC was limited. It was limited not only in the will, but it was also limited in its founding document. It was dependent in both cases upon complete accord with the founder Acharya for legitimacy. What has gone down since 1978 comes not close to meeting the standard of that directive from the charter of the GBC, known as the Direction of Management. So-called ISKCON has no spiritual authority. It has not had any such spiritual authority for over 4 decades, since the unauthorized imposition of the zonals. What it does have in place of such authority and in the guise of spiritual authority is institutional power. That is the aspect of a formalized religion which has deviated from its founder Acharya. It is what the Grand Inquisitor was referring to when he said, as just mentioned, quote, "We have corrected your work," unquote. It is a fantasy that so-called ISKCON in general, or the GBC in particular, possesses spiritual authority. However, perception substitutes for reality, and this Kali Yuga principle is especially prominent in so-called ISKCON. That Upasampradaya is doing its own thing via its own peculiar concoction of power. Power which is not insignificant if you get within the wheelhouse of its control. The vitiated GBC has created a psychic iron trap for those who get in that circle, transmuting the governing body into the functional equivalent of a deity possessing the authority of all the demigods. Reject it. Reject the GBC mystique. Finally, we segue to all-pervading cult secrecy. Secret 1, the centralization scheme of 1972. It was kept secret from all the devotees at that time and for years thereafter, except for the ad hoc committee of 8 which hatched it, and one of them even implemented it. Prabhupada came down hard on them. He suspended the GBC, directly commenting in a letter to his temple presidents, with an exclamation point in that suspension letter, that the whole proceeding was both unauthorized and secret, which obviously it should not have been. Secret number 2, the ultra-important directive in the charter of the Direction of Management that the GBC had to be rotated every 3 years by vote of temple presidents. It was their fiduciary responsibility, that vote. But that vote in the charter was kept secret from all of the presidents except those who were also commissioners involved in keeping it secret. Secret number 3, the severe condition of Prabhupada's health and emaciated physical body in the final days, along with the fact that he was virtually not even eating anymore since the spring of 1977. This was kept secret from the rank and file. Secret 4, the fact that Prabhupada only appointed Ritviks and never formally or officially designated anyone as Diksha Guru. That was kept a secret for over 2 years. This actual fact was changed to the 11 Ritviks that they allegedly were automatically to become Diksha Gurus once the founder left the scene. And that change was not revealed for another 2 years. Secrecy was at the base of the whole prevarication, creating a false sense of fascination in the 11 great pretenders. Secret number 5, the fact that copies of all of the letters were kept in a vault at the Los Angeles temple until smuggled out in the mid-80s to Sulochan. That vault was part of the reign of secrecy imposed by the leading secretaries. There was essential information in some of those letters, and much of that was revealing just how much Prabhupada was disturbed and disappointed by the unpredictability of his unreliable and often deviant leading secretaries. Secret 6, the worship of pseudo-demigods was taking place throughout virtually every temple of so-called ISKCON from the late spring of 1978 onward. When altar desecration is intrinsic to such worship, and falsely initiated disciples are worshiping men who are only sahajiyas, the ghee lamp, as part of the ritual, it seems to be meaningful, but the secret is that it has no meaning whatsoever. The Bannermen of the ISKCON Anomaly were in deep error. Their emergence to power in the hijacking of a bona fide spiritual and devotional movement was part of the chaos of the unexpected. The whole pantomime was loaded with misinformation and mistaken knowledge disguised as enlightenment and bliss. there were no immediate silver linings to any of it. The incompetence endemic was mind-boggling. All that new information, much of it imbibed from Gaudiya Mutt, was infused with danger, which only a handful of devotees at that time were able to recognize, and fewer still able to overcome. Sure, in the beginning there was heightened curiosity and some cheap thrills, but those were also undergirded by subconscious terror. The motivational significance of the Zonal Acharya takeover was solely emotional, as in mundane pseudo-spiritual emotion. A new adaptation set into the movement for those who chose to stay in the thing. It was no longer under the protection of Providence, but this was realized too late for those who were the most unfortunate. As stated previously, the cause remains in the current effect. The current effect today, and both register under material destiny, under fate. It was all predestined as soon as the stranger was allowed not only entrance into the movement, but undue prominence. The whole disaster created a known, the emergence of today's chaos. One transformation has given way to another one in the mid-'80s, and that one has given way to the one that's functioning today in so-called ISKCON, which is also going to fade. Disorder dovetails well with intrigue, treachery, and betrayal, the coin of the ISKCON realm. It dovetails with pseudo-miracle, mystery, power disguised as authority, and secrecy. It was a territory that we were never meant to explore, but which we now must confront. Today's so-called ISKCON, although it is not recognized as such by many, is a place of fear, felt in the form of a subconscious imprint throughout the cult. The values in it have changed according to each interpretation introduced during the 3 transformations. There was tragic suffering in each of them, particularly at the junction points, when one transformation was forced to give way to the next. All of that created massive disillusionment for the vast majority of devotees, and particularly for the rank and file. Each transformation was based upon a myth. Disorientation and depression accompanied each of them. Each was a product of mistaken knowledge, replaced by another mistake. Such mistakes produced intelligent doubt, along with mental fear, and the victims started to wake up, some of them. The irony in all of that was invisible while it was going on. It only became visible for those who wanted to see it much later. Each transformation was introduced without clarity, as evidenced by the fact that it had to be replaced by another one. Krishna consciousness does not thrive in such a muddle. Krishna consciousness is meant for knowledge and enlightenment, but so-called ISKCON has been a source of unpredictability in the fog of battle amongst its drama queens, operating within a matrix of mythic imagination, which is absurd and which is not supra-rational. If the shoe fits, then so-called ISKCON may be wearing it. In point of fact, so-called ISKCON corresponds to a chimera, a thing that is hoped for and wished for, but is impossible to achieve in current context. It is impossible to achieve what is advertised by so-called ISKCON. what it advertises it can provide those who are entangled in its relationships and its actions. Because it's a deviated cult. It's an upasampradaya. It cannot provide you access to the spiritual world. As we have said many times, so-called ISKCON covers Krishna consciousness in the name of spreading it. But you can best know that if you've been in it. Otherwise, you can be lucky enough to hear and not have to experience what it will otherwise subject you to, especially when, out of despair, you become its victim and throw out the baby with its bathwater. Always remember and never forget that so-called ISKCON is doing its own thing. This has been the case for decades. It is under the jurisdiction of fate. The guru must be a very perfect man. But so-called ISKCON contains no such men or women. It is an anomaly that has spawned many splinter groups, and it will continue to do so. All of its leaders are agents of chaos. Realize this now so that you can live and prosper in genuine Krishna consciousness. Sadeva Samya.